On my 67th birthday, a package arrived on my porch. No card, no sender's name, just 2 cold words written in blue ink. Happy birthday. But I recognized that handwriting instantly. The loops and slants belonged to the daughter I hadn't seen in 3 years. The same daughter I had raised alone. The same daughter who had walked away without looking back. Inside the box was a limited edition bottle of red wine, sealed with golden wax and dressed in a deep green label. It was expensive, far beyond what Victoria would ever casually spend. And she knew I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol since my heart attack. That bottle wasn't a gift. It was a message. Instead of keeping it, I gave it to George Miller, my old friend and in-law, a man who had never shown up at my door empty-handed. I thought I was passing along a luxury he would enjoy. I had no idea I was handing him death in a glass. By morning, George was in the hospital, fighting for his life. The doctors said his blood carried traces of aconitine, a poison so deadly it can stop a heart within hours. And that was only the beginning. Life has a way of folding in on itself when loss becomes your closest companion. For me, that loss began 12 years ago, the night my husband collapsed in our kitchen. A sudden heart attack, quick and merciless. One moment he was reaching for the sugar jar, the next he was gone. At 55, I became a widow, and the house that had always echoed with voices turned into a cavern of silence. My daughter, Victoria, was just 22 at the time. I thought grief would bind us closer, that we'd share the weight of absence, but it worked like acid instead. It burned slowly, eating away at every tender part of our bond. She blamed me for not calling the ambulance fast enough. I blamed myself too, but in silence. The difference is I carried that guilt quietly, while she sharpened it into a weapon and pointed it at me. The years after my husband's death weren't gentle. My health began to falter. A mild stroke, then a heart scare that left me with a stack of prescriptions and a permanent ban on wine, whiskey, and anything that once made evenings warm. When the doctors stripped away alcohol, it felt like they'd stripped away memories too. I used to sit with my husband on the porch with a glass of Cabernet as the sun set. After the ban, I sat alone, hands folded, remembering. Money was another battle. We were never wealthy, but my husband's small carpentry business had kept us comfortable. After he died, clients disappeared. I sold his tools, then the workshop, just to keep the house. To make ends meet, I took in sewing jobs, hemming dresses, patching jeans for neighbors who pitied me enough to pay. Some months, the lights flickered because the bill waited longer than it should. I hid all of this from Victoria, thinking she didn't need more burdens. But secrets have a way of sounding like lies to those who already want to doubt you. When Victoria married Andrew Miller, I hoped it would bring us closer. His parents, George and Helen, treated me like family. George once climbed onto my roof at dawn after a storm tore shingles loose. He didn't even knock first. That's the kind of man he was. Steady, practical, dependable. He made me feel like maybe not everyone had turned their back. Victoria, though, grew colder. She didn't invite me to their anniversary dinners. She skipped holidays. She said my house smelled like medicine, that being around me made her feel old. I swallowed every insult because she was all I had left. When she stopped visiting entirely 3 years ago, I told myself she'd come back when she was ready. Mothers tell themselves lies like that so they don't crumble. The truth? I lay awake at night listening to the clock tick, wondering if she even remembered the sound of my voice. When the mailbox stayed empty on my birthdays, I told myself she was busy. When she didn't call on Christmas, I told myself phones break. But by the second year of silence, I stopped pretending. I stopped hoping. And then came this year, my 67th birthday, a plain box on the porch, sealed tight, with 2 words in blue ink that dug into my chest like claws. Happy birthday. No mom, no signature, just cold familiarity, as if she wanted me to know without daring to say. I sat at the kitchen table staring at that bottle of wine. The golden wax gleamed under the morning light, mocking me. I thought about the heart attack that nearly ended me 3 years ago, how Victoria sat in the hospital room staring at her phone instead of at me. She knew I couldn't drink again, she knew. And yet this bottle, more extravagant than anything she had ever given me, was her return gift. I wanted to believe it was a peace offering, but my gut told me otherwise. You don't vanish for 3 years and come back with something that dangerous, that deliberate. Still, when George's face came to mind, George who had never failed me, George who deserved something fine for once in his life, I told myself it would be better in his hands than collecting dust on my shelf. That decision, simple and innocent, would nearly cost him his life, and it would force me to face a truth I'd been avoiding. Sometimes the sharpest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people you brought into this world. By the time I turned 67, life had begun to resemble something steady again. Not joyful. No, I'd stopped expecting joy years ago, but steady. And steadiness can feel like success when you've spent so long stumbling. The house, though worn, was mine. I'd refinanced twice, cut corners, and patched what needed patching until it became a sort of fortress. Every creak in the floorboards, every draft through the windows, I knew them like scars on my own body. What once felt like an empty shell of grief had transformed into a place of order, each shelf carefully arranged, each drawer labeled. It was survival disguised as neatness, but it kept me moving forward. My health, too, had reached a fragile balance. Daily walks around the block with Helen Miller, twice weekly check-ins with my doctor, a kitchen full of bland but safe meals. My heart was weaker than it used to be, but it still carried me from dawn to dusk. There were mornings when I woke to the sound of birds and allowed myself to believe I might live long enough to see 70, maybe 75. That felt like victory. I'd even carved out a small source of income beyond sewing. After George repaired my roof, he suggested I start baking for the church fair again. I laughed at first, but he was persistent. So I tried, timidly at first, then more confidently as neighbors began to request my pies. Word spread, and before long I had regular customers. Each month I tucked away a few extra dollars in a biscuit tin behind the flour jar. It wasn't wealth, but it was independence. And for a woman who had once felt stripped of everything, that was no small thing. The Millers, George and Helen, were my anchor. Where Victoria had turned cold, they turned warm. They invited me to dinners, helped with repairs, included me in holidays when their extended family visited. Their kindness reminded me of what family used to feel like. Sometimes I wondered if Victoria resented them for stepping into the role she had abandoned. Maybe that was one more reason for her silence. And so, in those quiet months before the package arrived, I had convinced myself that my story had shifted course. From widowhood and estrangement into something gentler. I wasn't surrounded by the love of my daughter, but I was alive, I was cared for, and I could still find purpose in small routines. The ache of her absence never faded, but I learned to carry it, the way you carry an old wound, limping but still walking. There were even moments I allowed myself to imagine reconciliation. Perhaps one day Victoria would knock on my door, embarrassed but willing. Perhaps she'd see me with flour on my hands, smile faintly, and remember who I was to her. I kept that hope tucked away, like a candle you don't light but can't throw out. That's why, when the package appeared, I froze not from fear, but from something crueler, recognition. The familiar curves of her handwriting cut through me, sharper than any blade. After years of silence, my daughter had spoken again, not with words, not with warmth, but with ink on cardboard. And I told myself it was a gift, a bridge, a way back. That was the success I thought I had built, the strength to believe in possibilities, even when the evidence was thin. I couldn't know that the bottle on my kitchen table wasn't a bridge at all. It was a trap, a message written not in ink but in poison. The first time I heard her voice again, it came through the phone like a ghost pressing its lips against the receiver. "Happy birthday, Mom." The words sounded rehearsed, not warm, flat and cautious, like she was testing how they might land. I stood in my kitchen, hand clenched around the phone cord. For a second, I didn't know what to say. "Victoria," I finally managed, her name breaking the silence like a piece of glass. "You got my gift?" she asked. I hesitated. I did. "Well," she said, "what did you think?" My eyes flicked to the empty spot on the counter where the bottle had sat just yesterday, before I'd buckled it into my passenger seat and driven it to George's house. "It's beautiful," I said truthfully. "Did you open it yet?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge, as if the answer mattered more than politeness. "No," I said carefully. "I gave it to George. He'll enjoy it more than I could." Silence. Not the natural pause of conversation, but something heavy, deliberate, as though my words had landed in the wrong place. "You gave it to George?" she repeated. "That's right." Another long pause, then a single exhale, slow and controlled. "Huh." And the line went dead. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the receiver in my hand. The house felt colder, like the air itself had shifted. I knew the way her tone had changed, the sudden tightness, the strange emphasis. It wasn't about generosity or sentiment. That bottle meant something else, something I hadn't understood. The next morning, the phone rang again. A woman's voice, Helen Miller. "Eleanor," she said, strained. "George is in the hospital. He collapsed this morning. They think it's poisoning." My blood turned to ice. "He was fine last night," she continued, "but this morning he could barely stand. The doctors are running tests." I could hear the monitors beeping in the background, the shuffle of nurses, Helen's voice breaking. "Poisoning," I repeated, my own voice hollow. "Yes, he only had a glass of wine with dinner." The room spun around me. My eyes darted to the counter where the bottle had been, where I had placed it in George's hands, thinking I was giving him a gift. When I hung up, I went straight to the trash bin. At the bottom was a small plastic vial, cap screwed on tight. A faint dusting of powder clung to its walls. I didn't remember throwing it away. My pulse hammered, and then I remembered the leftover wine, the half glass I'd poured into a mason jar before sending the bottle with George. Without even realizing, I had kept the only surviving sample. My hands shook as I placed the jar and vials side by side on the counter. That's when I knew this wasn't an accident. Victoria hadn't sent me a gift. She had sent me a weapon. By evening, I was driving to see Karen Lewis, the only person I trusted. She worked late at the veterinary lab on the edge of town. I wrapped the jar in a paper bag and held it tight against me like evidence I didn't want the world to see. Karen met me in the parking lot, her lab coat over a sweatshirt. "Eleanor, what's this?" "I need you to test something," I said, my voice trembling. She looked at me hard, then took the bag. "Is this something I'm going to regret?" "Just tell me what's in it." She nodded, disappeared inside. I sat in my car, watching the sky bleed from orange to black. The next day, she called. Her voice was low, heavy. "Eleanor, it's aconitine from wolfsbane, enough to stop a heart." The words slammed into me. My knees buckled and I had to sit before I fell. "She drank it?" Karen asked. "George did," I whispered. "Not me." "Then you dodged a bullet," she said. "But Eleanor, this isn't random. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." I hung up, my hands shaking, and sat in silence. That evening, the phone rang again. I answered on instinct. "Mom." Victoria's voice softer this time, but edged with steel. "We need to talk. Sooner rather than later." I gripped the receiver, my eyes on the mason jar on the counter. "I don't think we do," I said. A pause. Don't make this worse than it is." And then she hung up. That night, I wrote everything down. Dates, times, words. I wrote her pauses, her tones, the way she breathed on the line. Evidence. Because in my gut, I knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a taste of metal in my mouth, the kind that doesn't come from food but from fear that never digests. I brewed coffee I didn't drink, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the mason jar sitting in the fridge. It looked innocent, amber liquid curling against the glass like it had no agenda. That's the thing about poison. It never looks like poison. It looks like something you trust. I called Detective Marcus Reed by mid-morning. I didn't tell him everything yet, not the parts about my daughter, not the gut certainty I had. Instead, I gave him the facts. The bottle, the hospital call from Helen, the vial in the trash, the leftover wine. He listened without interrupting, his breathing steady on the line. When I finished, he said only, "Can you hold on to the sample until we collect it? And Eleanor, don't confront anyone yet. Let us do our job." I promised him I would, but promises have a way of breaking when blood is involved. By noon, I found myself driving across town. The mason jar locked in a tin box under the passenger seat, my recorder tucked inside my jacket. Victoria's house looked neat as always, every bush trimmed, every blind perfectly aligned. She had always hated disorder. I knocked once, and when the door opened, she looked at me as though I were the intruder, not the mother who'd raised her. "Mom," she said, surprise and calculation flickering across her face in quick succession. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" I asked, stepping past her before she could block me. The house smelled of lemon and bleach, too clean. Not a family home, but a showroom. She followed me into the kitchen, her movements sharp, rehearsed. On the counter sat 3 bottles of wine, all unopened, all expensive. I let my hand trail over one of them. "Quite the collection," I said. She folded her arms. "Andrew likes to have options." "Funny," I said. "George liked the one you sent me, said it was the nicest pour he'd ever had." Her jaw twitched. "You gave it to George?" "Yes, he's in the hospital now, poisoned." She blinked once, too slowly, like her mind was racing behind her eyes. Then she shook her head with a soft laugh. "Mom, you're overthinking again. You always do this. You find something to fix even when it isn't broken." I stepped closer. "And yet George's heart nearly stopped last night. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Silence stretched between us, the refrigerator humming the only sound. I slid a small recorder from my pocket, thumb brushing the red light before tucking it back. "I'm going to ask you one question," I said, "and the silence after it will be your answer. Did you put something in that wine?" Her eyes narrowed, lips parting, but no words came out. The air grew heavy with her silence. "Goodbye, Victoria," I said finally, turning for the door. "Don't walk away from me," she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. I stopped but didn't turn. "I'm not walking away. I'm collecting." That night, I played the recording back. Her pauses, her tones, her silence. It wasn't a confession, but it was something. Proof comes in pieces like bricks. You just have to stack them high enough until they make a wall no one can knock down. The following day, I went to see George at the hospital. Helen sat by his side, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles looked white. George was pale but breathing, the machines keeping him honest. "The doctors said it was aconitine," Helen whispered. "They think it was in the wine." I nodded. "I still have a sample. I'm turning it over to the police today." Helen looked at me with eyes that begged for answers I didn't have. "Who would do this, Eleanor?" I swallowed. The truth sat like a stone in my throat. "Someone who knew I couldn't drink it myself," I said. Later that afternoon, I met Detective Reed in his office. The room smelled of coffee and paperwork, walls lined with files that looked like they had been sitting longer than either of us had been alive. I placed the tin box on his desk, opened it and slid the mason jar toward him. His gloves were on before he touched it. "This will go to the state lab," he said. "If it's what you think it is, we'll have proof." "And if it is?" I asked. "Then we find out who handled it." "And Eleanor, don't speak to your daughter until I tell you to." But blood ties are hard to sever, even when they strangle. That evening, as I sat with the house lights dimmed, the phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. When I played it back, her voice filled the room. "Mom, you're making a mess of this. You went to the cops. That's not smart. We could have handled it between us. You're not thinking straight." I wrote her words down on an index card, slid it into a fireproof box with the rest. Dates, times, evidence. Because I had learned something over the years. Memory is soft, but ink is steel. The next morning, I woke before dawn and walked the house, every lock checked, every latch secured. Still, when I reached the front door, I noticed something off, a new scuff on the strike plate. The kind that comes from a key cut slightly wrong. No forced entry, but someone had been here. I set a piece of thread across the frame, taped it down, the way an old corporal had taught me decades ago, a trick to tell whether someone had crossed a line when you weren't looking. You don't trap a thief. You tell a story about whether he's been there. That afternoon, I drove past Victoria's house again, not stopping this time, just watching. Her blinds were shut. Her driveway was empty. Still, I felt the weight of her eyes somewhere in the air, watching me back. When I returned home, the thread was still in place, untouched. But I didn't feel safe. Safety isn't about locks or alarms. It's about knowing who wants you gone. That night, another call, another voicemail. "Mom, don't make this worse than it is. Call me." I didn't. I wrote it down, added it to the stack. Because I knew now what I had been denying for years. My daughter hadn't come back to reconcile. She had come back to finish me. The days that followed blurred into a strange kind of routine, as though fear itself had become my schedule. Morning coffee I didn't drink. Afternoon walks where every sound behind me felt like footsteps. Evenings spent at the kitchen table with a pen, a stack of index cards, and the fireproof box that was slowly filling with pieces of a story I hadn't asked to write. I laid them out like puzzle pieces. Card 1. Package arrived. Handwriting matched Victoria's. Card 2. Gave wine to George. Hospital collapse. Card 3. Vial in trash. Powder residue. Card 4. Mason jar with leftover sample. Card 5. Karen's confirmation. Aconitine detected. Card 6. Victoria's call. Tone shifted when she learned bottle was given away. Card 7. Voicemail. Don't make this worse than it is. Each card was a nail. Each nail was another strike into the coffin of doubt. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overthinking. My daughter had crossed a line and I had the evidence to prove it. But evidence alone isn't justice. Justice requires order, chain of custody, the kind of language lawyers and juries can't twist into smoke. Detective Reed reminded me of that when he came by one evening to collect the mason jar formally. He photographed the label, the seal, even the dust on the lid before placing it in an evidence bag. "Eleanor, if you want this to hold up, you can't handle it anymore. Let us do it by the book." I nodded, though letting go of that jar felt like surrendering my last bit of control. When he left, I returned to the box. If the jar was gone, then I needed more. So I began cataloging everything else. I copied Victoria's voicemails word for word onto cards, then onto a spiral notebook. I backed up the recordings from my old digital recorder onto a USB drive and hid it inside an empty flour tin. I photographed the vial before turning it over to Reed, the fine white dust clinging to its inner wall like a ghost that didn't want to leave. Even the house itself became evidence. That scuff on the strike plate. I crouched down, snapped a photo with my phone, and printed it at the pharmacy kiosk. I taped it to a card and wrote, "Possible entry with spare key." Victoria last had keys after my heart attack, never returned. I kept telling myself I was just being thorough, but the truth was darker. I didn't trust anyone else to carry the story right, not even the police. If they failed, if the courts failed, then my words, my notes, my photographs would have to speak after I no longer could. One night, while sorting through old paperwork in the hall closet, I found a tin that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were spare keys labeled in my late husband's neat block letters: front, back, garage. But tucked between them was another key, unmarked, its edges filed slightly uneven. My stomach clenched. This wasn't ours. I bagged it in plastic, added it to the box, and made another card. Unlabeled key, likely copy, found with household spares, chain of custody questionable. The next morning, I drove to Karen's lab again. She met me in the parking lot, eyes tired but steady. I handed her a folder of photos and notes. "Keep copies," I told her. "If anything happens to me, you'll know what to do." She looked at me long, then nodded. "You always were the stubborn type," she said softly. Later that day, Helen Miller called. George was improving. The doctors believed he would recover, though slowly. Relief washed through me, but it was tainted by guilt. My decision to pass along that bottle had nearly killed a man I respected. I swore to myself it would be the last mistake I made in this fight. That evening, I tested Victoria. I called her, voice calm. "I heard George is getting better." A pause, then, "That's good." "You'd know," I said, "since you chose the bottle." Silence. Too long. Then she laughed, brittle and false. "Mom, you're imagining things again." But the recorder in my pocket caught it all. The pause, the shift, the crack in her composure. Another nail. Over the following week, I layered every detail into the timeline. Phone records, screen captured before they could vanish. Texts forwarded to a second phone I kept hidden in the laundry room. Even my own handwritten notes were photocopied at the library and stored in a manila envelope under the loose floorboard in my bedroom. One morning, the mail brought a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of my porch, taken at night, the swing visible, the light above the door glowing. No person in the frame, but the angle suggested someone had been across the street watching. I bagged the photo, slid it into the box, and called Reed. "Don't discard it," he said immediately. "We'll log it." "You're being watched, Eleanor. We'll increase patrols near your street." But I didn't sleep easier. That night, I set a chair in the corner of the living room facing both doors, the box at my feet like a sentinel. Victoria's texts kept coming. "We need to talk. You're making this worse. Call me before it's too late." Each one was copied, dated, filed. Each one felt less like a plea and more like a warning. By the second week, my box held more than papers. It held my life compressed into exhibits: photos, recordings, notes, keys, voicemails, even my own fears written down in block letters so they couldn't be denied later. One evening, after filing another card, I realized what I had built. Not just a defense, but a case. A story too heavy to ignore, a bridge from suspicion to proof. It was then I understood. I wasn't just collecting evidence for the police, I was collecting it for myself. Because when betrayal comes from your own blood, truth is the only weapon left that doesn't poison you in return. Nights grew longer, and with them came a new kind of resolve. Fear was still there, of course, pacing the edges of every room, but it had changed shape. Fear was no longer the master, it had become fuel. Each voicemail from Victoria, each photograph slipped into my mailbox, each reminder that I was being watched. It all hardened into something sharper. Revenge, maybe, or perhaps just survival with claws. I began by asking myself a simple question. If my daughter thought I was still the woman who sewed hems and baked pies quietly in her kitchen, how could I use that against her? She saw me as weak. That was her mistake. Weakness bends. Weakness observes. Weakness waits. So I waited, but waiting without a plan is just surrender. I laid out my index cards on the kitchen table. Each piece of evidence like a soldier on parade, handwriting on the package, the vial, the mason jar, Karen's lab results, the spare key, the photograph of my porch at night, her voicemails, her pauses, her silence. Each was a fact, but facts alone didn't corner predators. Traps did. I decided the first trap would be conversation, not direct. Reed had warned me not to confront her, but through bait. I left her a voicemail of my own, careful with every word. "Victoria, we need to meet. I think I've misunderstood. Let's talk." My voice carried just enough fatigue to sound like surrender. Then I called Reed, told him what I'd done. He was furious, but when I explained my reasoning, he went quiet. "If she shows up, you call us immediately," he said. "Do not try to handle her alone." But I wasn't planning on handling her. I was planning on letting her handle herself. That night, I set up the living room like a stage. I placed my old digital recorder on the mantel, hidden behind a clock. I set a second phone to record video, angled at the kitchen table where I'd sit. And then, as an added layer, I tucked a tiny flash drive recorder into the pocket of my cardigan. 3 nets for 1 fish. For 2 nights, nothing. No calls, no knocks, only the usual silence that creaked through the house. Then on the 3rd night, just past 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. The thread I'd taped across the bottom of the door frame was broken. I opened the door to find her standing there, hood up, eyes bright but cold. "Mom," she said, voice low, "we shouldn't be doing this." "Then why are you here?" I asked, stepping back, letting her cross the threshold. She hesitated, then slipped inside, glancing around like a thief in her own childhood home. "You've talked to the police," she said. "I had to," I answered softly. "George nearly died." Her jaw clenched. "That wasn't for him. It was for you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my face still. "Why?" I whispered. She laughed bitterly. "Because you don't let go, do you? You never let me live my own life. Even after Dad died, you smothered me with guilt and expectations. I thought—" She stopped herself, eyes darting to the recorder clock on the mantel. She didn't notice the one in my pocket. I leaned forward, voice breaking just enough to feel real. "So you decided to finish me with poison?" Her eyes locked on mine, unflinching. It would have been quick. "Cleaner than the way you've killed everything else in my life." My hand trembled, not from fear, but from rage contained. "You gave me a gift, wrapped in death." "No," she said. "I gave you a choice. You gave it away." The silence after that sentence was thick enough to suffocate. I let it hang, then whispered, "You don't get to rewrite this, Victoria." Her mouth opened, but headlights swept across the window. Reed's unmarked car. I had timed the call perfectly. She turned, panic flashing across her face. "What did you do?" she hissed. "I stopped waiting to die," I said. The knock on the door came hard, official. Victoria bolted for the back, but Patel, the younger officer, was already there. She was cornered, her eyes wild, her body trembling with rage that looked too much like fear. As they led her out, cuffed, she twisted to look at me. "This isn't over, Mom. You'll regret this." I stood in the doorway, my cardigan pocket heavy with the recorder still running. "No, Victoria," I said. "I regret nothing." After they left, the house was silent again, but it was a different silence. Not the silence of fear, but of a trap sprung. I walked to the kitchen, pulled out the fireproof box and slipped the new card inside. Confession. Recorded 11:27 p.m. Victoria admits intent. For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe without looking over my shoulder. My plan hadn't been elaborate. It hadn't needed to be. Sometimes the best revenge isn't rage or punishment. Sometimes it's simply holding up a mirror and letting them damn themselves. Victoria had walked back into my house thinking I was still the woman she could silence. Instead, she'd handed me her own rope. And I would make sure it tightened. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and stale air, the kind of place where truth and lies sat on the same bench waiting for their turn. I had never imagined my life would lead me here, sitting stiff-backed in the front row while my only daughter was led in, wearing handcuffs. Victoria didn't look at me when she entered. Her chin was high, her expression carefully arranged into something between defiance and boredom. But I knew her too well. Her eyes betrayed the cracks, sharp, darting movements that spoke of fear. The prosecutor opened with the facts. The bottle of wine, the lab results from the state confirming aconitine, the vial recovered from my trash, the photographs of my door, the spare key, and finally, the recordings. My voice on the tape was steady. Hers was not. The jury leaned in as they heard her words. It wasn't for him. It was for you. Gasps rippled through the gallery. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't look away. This was what I had built toward. Every note, every card, every night spent awake in my kitchen, cataloging evidence. When it was her lawyer's turn, he tried to spin a different story. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're hearing is not a confession. It's a daughter venting years of resentment, dramatizing feelings, not admitting to crimes. My client never intended to harm her mother. This is a tragic misunderstanding being twisted into something criminal. But the jury's faces told me they weren't buying it. Resentment is one thing. Poison in a bottle is another. Then came the moment I had dreaded. My name was called, and I walked to the witness stand. The oath felt heavy on my tongue. The prosecutor's questions were simple. When did you receive the package? Did you recognize the handwriting? Did you consume the wine? I told the truth plainly. No embellishment, no theatrics, just the steady voice of a woman who had lived the story. Then the defense rose. Mrs. Barnes, he began smoothly, isn't it true that you and your daughter have been estranged for years? Yes. And isn't it true you've often blamed her for abandoning you after your husband's death? Yes. So could it be possible that your judgment is clouded? That you're interpreting her words through the lens of bitterness? I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. Bitterness doesn't put poison in a bottle. The jury stirred. He tried to press me further, suggesting the handwriting could have been forged, that perhaps George's collapse was coincidence. But every question only made my certainty sharper. When I stepped down, my legs were trembling, but my heart was steady. The climax came with the recording from that night in my kitchen. My cardigan pocket had caught everything, her admission, her fury, her words like knives. It would have been quick, cleaner than the way you've killed everything else in my life. The room went silent. Even her lawyer's shoulders sagged. Victoria finally looked at me then, her eyes burning with a hatred I had never seen before. For a moment, I almost couldn't recognize her. The child I'd raised, the woman who bore my blood. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was something else, something darker. When the judge finally called for recess, the gallery erupted in whispers. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras flashed. Neighbors who had once greeted me politely at the market now stared wide-eyed, as if seeing me for the first time. They weren't just hearing a case. They were witnessing the shattering of a family in public. I walked out into the hallway, the weight of every stare pressing down. But beneath that weight was something else. Release. For years, Victoria had tried to silence me with absence, then with fear. Now her words were out in the open, carved into the record for everyone to hear. It wasn't victory, not in the way people imagine it. It was raw, painful, heavy, but it was also undeniable. For the first time, the world knew the truth. And the truth had teeth. The trial ended not with a bang, but with a verdict that echoed like a hammer on stone. Guilty. The word landed in the courtroom with the weight of years. A final note to a song no mother ever wants to hear. Victoria was sentenced to 20 years without parole. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I simply sat there, spine straight, hands folded in my lap, while the world around me moved. The days afterward felt unreal. Neighbors avoided my eyes in the market, whispering in aisles when they thought I couldn't hear. Old friends called with voices thick with pity, offering casseroles and condolences, as if grief could be spooned away. The newspapers carried the story for a week, each headline colder than the last. Daughter poisons mother, botched attempt. My name was always there, printed in black and white. George recovered slowly, his skin still pale but his spirit stubborn as ever. When I visited, he gripped my hand and said, "Don't let guilt eat you, Eleanor. You didn't pour the poison." I nodded, but guilt is a shadow that doesn't leave when the light comes back. At night, the house felt too large, too quiet. I walked the halls with the fireproof box tucked under my arm like a relic. Inside were the index cards, the photos, the recordings, everything that had led to this point. Proof, yes, but also scars pressed into paper. I couldn't bring myself to burn them, yet I couldn't look at them either. One evening I sat on the porch swing, the same one I'd nearly abandoned months ago when fear stalked every step. The chains groaned gently as I rocked, the October air sharp in my lungs. Across the street, a boy rode his bike, laughing, free of the kind of weight that now hung in my chest. That's when I understood. Justice had been served, but peace was something I'd have to build myself. One day at a time. Victoria was gone, locked behind walls she'd built with her own hands. But the echoes of her voice, the little girl who once ran barefoot through this yard, calling Mom, with joy instead of venom, those echoes would never leave, and maybe they shouldn't. Some truths aren't meant to fade. They're meant to remind you where the line is and what it costs when someone you love crosses it. When the house grew still again, I stood in the doorway and listened to the silence. Not the silence of fear that once pressed against the windows, but the kind that comes after a storm. Heavy, uncertain, yet strangely clean. Victoria's sentence had ended one chapter, but not the book. Blood doesn't vanish with a gavel strike. It lingers in memories, in photographs, in the sound of a child's laugh that no prison can erase. I don't know if I'll ever see her again. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Maybe one day she'll write me from that cell, or maybe the silence will stretch forever. But I've stopped waiting for either. My life is my own again. And peace, as I've learned, isn't something handed to you. It's something you build. One steady breath, one locked door, one dawn at a time. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story gripped you, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment about where you're watching from. There are more stories ahead, some darker, some lighter, but all of them true in the way life forces truth on us. And remember, sometimes survival itself is the sharpest revenge.